All right, today we're going to talk about complex numbers, okay? So in the Common Core, it's NC, which stands for complex numbers, 1. And so what we're going to have to do is, it says no, there is a complex number, I, such that that's an I squared is equal to -1. And we're also going to talk about the complex ones, A plus or minus BI, okay? So that's right out of the Common Core. We have to learn this. Sophomores, you guys are going to have to take and pass the new state test, which is a bummer. And this stuff is on it. So this stuff isn't that hard. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we've got. So first of all, if I went to my calculator and tried to do this, and what the square root of -9, it won't work. It won't work. You cannot do square root of -9. It's a square root of a negative number. It doesn't exist. However, what we're going to do is try and change it then into a way that we can. So I'm going to rewrite it, and I'm going to rewrite it as the square root of 9 times the square root of -1, okay? And the reason I want to do that is because we learned that, sure enough, square root of -1 is just I. Well, I know what the square root of 9 is. That's just 3. And the square root of -1 is I. So the answer we're going to write is 3I. It's that easy. Okay, example 2. Same thing. If I tried to use my calculator, clear that, quit. If I tried to do the square root of a -12, it's not going to work. It says non-real. It's not real. You can't do it. So how do we do this? Well, I'm going to break it up into 3 different parts. 3 parts. One, I'm just going to, square root of 4. I'm going to go to the square root of 3. And I'm going to go to the square root of -1. By doing that, I can take the square root of 4, and I can call this I. I can call this I. So I'm going to go, square root of 4 I know is 2. Square roots of 3. And then I'm going to make this, square root of -1, into just I. So, when you see the square root of -1, we're going to write I.
Can you do 2I?
Can you do 2I? You can, yeah. You could, Megan, you can write the 2I squared is 3. Yes, you can. Absolutely. I always like to write the I at the end, but it's not wrong if you put it there, okay? Good question. Okay, example 3. Same stuff we've been doing. I'm going to rewrite this as 3. And I'll break down the 20 into the square root of 4, the square root of 5, and I'll take care of the negative by doing a square root of -1, right? So this isn't hard. Whenever we see the square root of -1, we're just going to write I. So I'm going to go 3 times 2, because square root of 4 is 2, square root of 5, and square root of -1 we know is as I. You just write as I. So grand answer of this one is 6 square roots of 5 I. It's not that difficult, is it? Okay, now example 4. This is why we learned I, is because of this equation right here, mathematically we couldn't solve it. We'd have to just put no answer. But we can get an answer now. The answer is going to be in terms of I. But before I do it, we are going to have 2 answers. Okay, we're going to have 2 answers because of the x squared. Okay? Yeah, thank you. We're going to get 2 answers because of the x squared. So, in order to solve it, I just take the square root of both sides, right? So I get x equals 2 answers. I'm going to go plus or minus. Plus or minus the square root of -81, okay? 2 answers came from an x squared. That's why I did the plus or minus. So, I know that the square root of 81, I'm going to go plus or minus the square root of 81 and the square root of -1. I know what the square root of 81 is. That's just 9. And then the square root of -1 we just learned is I. So I'm going to rewrite this as x is equal to plus or minus 9I. Now there are 2 answers there. And I would leave it like this. I really would. But if you want to see, the answers are x equals 9I and x equals -9I. Those are my 2 answers. But the plus or minus means both of those. It's just easier for me to write positive 9 and -9 than to write it twice. But it does mean both of these, okay? All right, example 5. Well, I'm going to have 3 answers. We're going to have 3 answers because of the cube. So the first thing I'm going to do is I recognize that I can common factor, okay? They both have a multiple of 3, and they both have a common x. So I'm going to common factor out a 3 and x. This is what they have in common. So take out the 3x. Okay, so if I common factor out the 3x, what's left inside would be an x squared plus 25. Well, let's just try and solve it. So if I'm going to take, and I want to solve. So I'll take 3x equals 0, right? That's 1. I'll get one answer from there. And I'll also do an x squared plus 25 equals 0, because I have to solve. So I've got two equations. This one is easy to solve for. I'm just going to divide by 3. 0 divided by 3 is just 0. Okay, so there's one of my three answers. There's one. I got to come up with two more, so I go to the other one. Now, I know with the x squared, definitely here's where I'm going to get my other two answers. So minus 25 minus 25, well, an x squared equals a negative 25, because I subtracted 25, brought it over, minus 25 minus 25. And then I'm going to square root it. To undo the square, I'm going to square root, so I got x equals plus or minus, because of the two answers, square root of negative 25, which is going to be plus or minus the square root of 25 times the square root of negative 1. Just broke it up because negative 25 would be 25 times 1. I know what the square root of 25 is. It's just 5, right? It's 5. And the negative square root of negative 1, whenever you see that, write I. Whenever you see this, you write I. So my other two answers are plus or minus 5I. There are three answers. 0, positive 5I, and negative 5I. Those are my three answers. Okay, not too bad. So, before we turn it, whenever you see square root of negative 1, write I. Okay, turn the page. Okay. Now, example 6. Example 6 isn't that bad. We're going to solve. So, in order to solve, I'm going to go minus 4, okay? I'll have quantity x minus 3 squared equals negative 4, right? I'm going to square root both sides, but I do know I'm going to need two answers because of the x squared, okay? So I take the square root, and what happens? I get an x minus 3, the square root, and the square will cancel each other out. They're like opposites, equals plus or minus the square root of negative 4. Now, plus or minus because I know there's two answers. That's why I did the plus. In fact, I'm going to highlight that for you. Two answers, and that's why I did the plus or minus, okay? Two answers, I have to have the plus or minus because I took it from an x squared. Okay, now, this can't be done. Your calculus is going to give you an error. So what we're going to do is make it an I. So I'm going to have an x minus 3 equals plus or minus 2I. You okay? I skipped a step. Be okay on the step I skipped because we all know the square root of 4 is 2, and we knew the negative gave me a negative 1, which gave me I, okay? Now, the last thing I'm going to do is go plus 3, right? I'll go plus 3, I'll add 3 to both sides, add 3 to both sides. Here's the thing. You can't add these. That's an I, and that's a real number. You cannot add these. That's an I number, and that's a real number. So we write the answer as just 3 plus or minus 2I. And there are two answers there. One is, you don't have to write this, but there are two answers. One is 3 plus 2I, and then the other is 3 minus 2I, okay? Jackie.
Could it be 2I plus
two,
or minus 2I?
Plus 3? It can, but the only reason I would say don't write it that way is if you go back to our reading, right, we always write it as real number plus imaginary, okay? I would never mark that wrong, Jackie, but we like to have the real number plus the imaginary, okay? That was a great question, by the way, okay? Now, example 7. Here's the hard one. We can do this. It won't factor. Multiples of 35 are not going to make negative 10. It's not going to happen. So I gave you a hint. Let's complete the square. So way back on Wednesday, we talked about completing the square. And then I put it up on the board. Put all the steps for completing the square up on the whiteboard to help us out, okay? So let's try and do this by completing the square. So step 1, what do? Move C to the other side. So I'm going to take my 35 and bring it over. How do I bring it over?
Subtract it.
Yeah, subtract it. So I'll have an x squared minus 10x equals negative 35. Okay, but leave a little space here because we're going to fill that. We're going to fill that hole, okay? Step 2, common factor out a. Well, there's no step 2, okay? There's no number here, so we don't have to do step 2, okay? There's no number here. Okay, but what's step 3 say? Take 1/2 of b squared. So first of all, b is negative 10. Okay, there's my b. Here's my b, okay? I'm going to take half of that. So I'm going to take half of that, which is negative 5, right? Half of negative 10 is negative 5. And then I'm going to square it. Take 1/2 b squared, so now I'm going to square it. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to square it. Gives me a positive 25, okay? So let me go back to completed square. So completed square says this. Okay? Take half of b. b is 10. Yeah. Okay? Yeah, sure. b is negative 10, right? Half of that is a negative 5. Square negative 5, you get a positive 25. See, I did it? Half of that, and then square it. Half of that's negative 5, square it, and you get a positive 25, okay? So what do we do with that? Okay, then it says add that to both sides. Keep it balanced, right? Add that to both sides. So let me just put in my plus 25, plus 25. Hi, Simon.
Hi. You counted me not here today, and they're yelling at me.
Oh, you were really late, weren't you?
Yeah, I was like 10 minutes late.
Okay.
Well, you counted me fully absent.
Okay, I'll take care of it. Yeah. Okay. So then, what's our next step say? Factor, right? So to factor it, I'm going to go, and I can factor this. Okay, what times what makes 25? What times make
5.
5 and 5? And how do we make a negative 10 with a negative 5?
And a negative 5.
What do you know? And that equals a negative 10, right? But I can rewrite this in a better way, right? See, in my completed square, I want to write it as x minus a quantity squared. I want to write it like that. So I'm going to rewrite this as really a x minus 5 quantity squared equals negative 10. Okay, now, we haven't even started to solve it yet. All we did is we got it into a form that we can solve it, okay? So what did we do over here to solve it? What did we do? Yeah, and that's where we do the same thing. We're going to square root, right? And I know two answers, right? Got to have two answers, so I take the square root. So if the square root and the square kind of like opposites, they cancel each other out. So I have an x minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 10, okay? You cannot, here's good news for us, you can't reduce 10. I mean, the multiples of 10 won't work. I mean, so you're stuck with the 10, right? You can't do anything with 10. So here's what I'm going to have. An x minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 10 I. Now, where'd the I come from?
Because a negative 1
There's,
square root.
right? You guys see the negative square root? Yeah, or the negative 1, right? And then all I'm going to do now is bring over the 5. I'm going to add 5. My answer is x equals 5 plus or minus the square root of 10 I. And you cannot add those because that's a real number and that's an imaginary. You cannot add them if they're different. Okay,